Hi everyone, my name is Hilary Lundgren and I'm the program coordinator for the Washington FireAdapted Communities Learning Network. In my previous position, I was the director of the Chumstick Wildfire Stewardship Coalition based out of Leavenworth, Washington. And over the years, the Chumstick Coalition had been learning about and kind of facilitating post-fire recovery impacts, even though we really haven't had any significant wildfires here in Leavenworth for a while. So how and why did we get started doing this work? And it's still very much emerging in our community. So in 2012, Liz, if you could forward the slide one, that would be great. So in 2012, there were, you'll see on the slide, Wenatchee, the Chumstick Coalition is kind of right there in the middle of Washington State. There was the Wenatchee Complex, and there were, as you can see, there's several fires there within 20 miles of Leavenworth. And the previous director, Annie Schmidt, had been working for the coalition for some time and started to reach out to those communities and to partners to see if we could help and to see what we could do. So she encountered Catherine Rowden from NOAA, and Catherine worked on post-fire, kind of the landscape piece of post-fire recovery or post-fire impact, mostly related to flooding. And she was a huge proponent of getting information out to homeowners and landowners, but was really kind of struggling on how to do that and how we could do it. So she wanted to let people know that there was still something that you could do. You could, after the fire, you could still call your insurance agent. You could still kind of like prepare. You could still take inventory of your home. There were just these like little things that you would kind of need to do following a fire, because the storm really isn't over, as a lot of you know. So then in 2013, the Eagle Creek fire hit. So that's right next to that little icon on your screen of the Chumstick Coalition. And that fire wasn't really significant. It was fairly low intensity. But the Chumstick Coalition, with Annie at the helm, pretty much was like, we need to get this post-fire information out. And so she basically sprinted and developed 60 door hangers saying, okay, please be aware there are post-fire impacts that could be coming your way. So she worked with the local fire districts, and on their drill night, which was a Tuesday, they got the door hangers out. It wasn't a huge amount of information that went out, but it was something. And then sure enough, 2 days later, after the fire had ended, everybody's phone went off for a flash flood warning. So debris flows ensued, and there were some impacts to some homes. So this just really drove home that the success that we did have was developed because we had those partnerships with the fire district, and it was really, really important that the homeowners and landowners had that information and that we were able to get it out to them immediately, like, well, if not like during the fire, but immediately after the fire, so that at least they were aware that something else could be coming. So next slide, please, Liz. So we then asked the question, like, what if we created a toolkit? And we were looking how both communities and landscapes are going to recover, and we partnered with the Fire Learning Network to put together some generic materials that could be used across multiple communities, and that was a tool for them to like press print and go if they were like in the moment or dealing with a post-fire landscape. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what the toolkit entails. So it's a customizable toolkit which can be found on afterthefire.org, and it includes door hangers, public service announcements, brochures, flooding information, and templates for like social media posts and newspapers so that you can get the information out to the homeowners and landowners in case they need it. It has some great graphics, so like if you're returning home, these are the things that you immediately need to think about and look at as a homeowner and landowner. So we had something. We had something that we can share. And the communities, anybody is available to download this off of the website, and you can add your own resources in there, your own contact information, anything that you would need to pass out to help homeowners and landowners kind of think about these post-fire impacts. The toolkit is very landscape-centered, so that's just something to keep in mind, that there are much more impacts than what happens on the landscape, such as emotional impacts and the loss of a home sometimes, or pets and animals. Next slide, please, Liz. So that was 2013, and then in 2014, Washington experienced some of the, at the time, the largest and some of the most catastrophic fires in state history. And now with some materials to share, and newly formed relationships with NOAA and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Chumstick had kind of a team. And so during the fires, we had information, we had some capacity. We realized that we could get some support. So this team started going to the incident management teams during the fire just to try to get on the agenda, for the briefings, for public meetings, for any type of media thing, but they were not successful. So the teams agreed to introduce NOAA and let them know that they were in the room, but not really allocate any time to speak to the community and to speak to the homeowners and landowners that these post-fire impacts could be possibly happening. So the team kind of regrouped. They created a kind of a shareable Google Doc that listed the agencies who did post-fire recovery work, a schedule of potential meetings and opportunities that they could go and speak and present at, and talking points. So every partner that Annie and Catherine had made had access to this document, and they would be able to kind of address these issues as they were moving through their work. So they kind of split up duties, and they kept trying again, and eventually they were successful. So they started going to the trainings for the incident management teams and sharing this information. So that was pretty significant, just to be able to have, because when a fire is happening, you have an opportunity to share these types of messages. So then the Carlton Complex hit. So that was a really, really big deal for Washington. 326 home and structures were lost. It changed the game. It definitely changed our conversation of these post-fire impacts really didn't just affect landscapes, but they affected a lot of people. So we, during that fire, we were able to, with partners and working with kind of civic and Rotary, civic groups in our community like Rotary, get information up to that fire and get it distributed throughout the community. So we tried to help in whatever ways that we could. Next slide, please, Liz. So also during this time, the Washington FireAdapted Communities Learning Network had formed, and Okanogan Conservation District was one of the core members, and it gave us an instant connection to those who were supporting wildfire recovery efforts. They were going through a lot, and after the fires, we really, really wanted to learn from them. So in 2015, we started a Leavenworth Area Community Wildfire Preparedness Week, and during this week, we hope to kind of inspire our community to take action through the experiences of others. And yeah, we probably capitalized on this. But I think we all struggle on how to engage homeowners and landowners in a lot of aspects of our work. So there were two specific events that were extremely powerful and moved our community thoughts and conversations forward to begin pre-planning for post-fire recovery. Next slide, please, Liz. So during the week, we had several different events. We had an event every day for 6 days, but two of the events that again were so powerful were the Business Resiliency workshop that we held and an event called the Spirit of Wildfire. At the Business Resiliency workshop, we invited business owners and chamber members from the Okanogan area, so from our neighbors up north who had just gone through a fire, a pretty significant fire, to come and share with our chamber members and our business owners about their experiences of loss and what it meant to them when the town was like just shut down, when there wasn't electricity, when and what the impacts were to their business and how they either were or weren't able to adapt. So there were some great connections made there. The chambers, our chamber director and the Methow chamber director agreed to support each other during this fire because there wasn't a mechanism to get information out, and so really we were trying to create these connections and partnerships so we could get information out, but it may have been coming from a different community. So it was a really great opportunity to get people kind of working together and realizes that we're all in this together. The second event that we hosted was a Spirit of Wildfire. So we partnered with it's called the Confluence Gallery and Art Center up in Twist, Washington, again in the Okanogan. And they put out a call to artists to develop artwork. Basically, we were going to have an art show and their response to fires. And with each piece that they created, they wrote an accompanying narrative about their own loss and recovery. And so we held an art opening. And during that art opening, we also invited a homeowner who had lost his home to share his story with our audience. And it was it was a very emotional event. And then we also invited a homeowner to share his story about his home surviving, about him sitting across the valley, watching a fire streak across the mountain, and while drinking a beer with his friends and just being like, okay, that one survived and that one didn't, and his was the only home out of 12 in their neighborhood to survive, and he had just completed his defensible space work. So they were able to share their stories through poetry, through art, through music, and through storytelling. So it was an amazing experience and really motivated some of the attendees to do this work. And especially in 2015, we had more fires hit that were larger and more catastrophic in Ashland and Okanogan. So more homes were lost. Even in Wenatchee, we had a fire that was pretty significant in our area where an ember went into the warehouse district, in downtown warehouse district. And we were faced with recovery again. So after these fires, there was a tremendous amount of work in these communities to form long-term recovery organizations, rebuild homes, fences, support the emotional needs of our neighbors in Eastern Washington. So today we have two organizations who have been not only instrumental but innovative in their post-fire recovery efforts with homeowners and landowners in their work of recovery. So I'd like to introduce Beth Stipe. She's the Executive Director from the Community Foundation of North Central Washington. So Beth moved to Wenatchee in 2003 to join the Community Foundation. She has 20 years of nonprofit experience and has served on volunteer boards, foundation management positions. Prior to working for the Community Foundation, Beth was the Executive Director of a private family foundation. And she and her husband have a great love of the outdoors, of biking and traveling. So in the wake of the fires, the Community Foundation formed a fire relief fund, and we've asked Beth to share the foundation's experiences and a little bit about the community role of the Community Foundation and their work in fulfilling the needs of some of our communities and how they can support homeowners and landowners during and after the fire. So, and Beth, I'll hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Hilary. So, yes, my name is Beth Stipe. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Foundation of North Central Washington, and I wanted to start out by telling you a little bit about community foundations. So there are over 700 community foundations in the United States. There are community foundations that are all over the world at this point. And basically what we are is we're a place-based, not-for-profit organization that builds permanent charitable endowments to support the regions or areas that we serve. The Community Foundation of North Central Washington covers 3 counties in Washington State, and so you can find community foundations that support a city, a county, multiple counties, or some of the community foundations in the country are actually statewide foundations. But we're uniquely positioned in the sense that we have a very broad mission, and so being able to support a broad range of needs that come up in our communities that we serve positioned us in a way that we were able to quickly step up and to support the needs of our communities as the fires came through in 2014 and 2015. So back in my previous life as a private foundation director, in 1997, I was part of a group who formed after a flood devastated a trailer park in Fort Collins, Colorado, where the foundation that I was working for provided funding. And so I'd had a little bit of experience in disaster relief funding that I was able to draw upon the morning after the fires came through the Carlton Complex and Brewster and Pateros, Washington. So I knew immediately that we had some long-term recovery issues that we were going to have to deal with, and so we immediately stepped up and set up a fund that people could make contributions to online, because when you have natural disasters that affect households and basically devastate households, it seems to often hit those folks who are least able to, or most vulnerable, least able to have resources available to help them withstand a big disaster like this. And so when you have the immediate aftermath, you have large-scale organizations that step up to the plate, such as the Red Cross, but you have to have a local presence for the long term, because Red Cross is not going to come in and set up shop and support the recovery of those folks. And when someone loses everything, it doesn't happen that they rebuild their lives overnight or within a couple of months. It's 2017 now. We still meet weekly. We still have over 100 cases of supporting folks who are still working on their recovery. In some cases, we've seen folks come forward a year, 18 months after the disaster, where they thought that they could recover on their own and they couldn't, and they need help. And so having a local source of unrestricted money that can be distributed to meet a variety of needs is really important. And as you all are sitting around thinking about preparing for potential disasters that come into your communities, I think it's really a smart move to engage your local community foundation, whether that's a regional or a statewide or a citywide foundation, or it might in some cases be multiple community foundations, and bring them to the table and find out who's going to do what. And certainly for us, it was, we had first the experience with Carlton Complex, then a year later we had the experience with the Okanogan Complex fires, two very different fires, and certainly we appreciate the work that the Red Cross does. They do excellent work on the immediate disaster, but they also are a very big organization that has some pretty strong parameters as to what they can and can't do, and that's just the nature of the beast. And so for us, when we had fires that were burning for days and days with people who were evacuated, and some of them, the evacuation shelters were 45 minutes or an hour from their homes. The needs are very different. You know, gas cards are important, certainly clothing, and some of the tools that the Red Cross has available to them requires their staff or their volunteers to ensure that there has been a loss. Well, when you have fires burning and you can't actually access the property for days, sometimes weeks, you have no idea what kind of losses these folks have sustained, but in the meantime, they still have needs. And so again, those local faith-based, community, local nonprofit organizations, community foundations, we have far more flexibility to meet those needs than large-scale national disaster organizations can. So one of the things that I learned from the flood in 1997 was that long-term case management is critical to set that up. We, at the Community Foundation, set aside about $100,000 immediately after the Carlton Complex fires to establish a case management system where we would have local people who would be there to intake clients who had losses, who sustained losses, to have that person that you could go to week after week who's consistent and the same to build a relationship with, because recovery it's just like losing a loved one. You've lost pretty much all of your possessions, and so you go through stages of grief. It takes a long time for folks to kind of assess where they are and where they want to go, and to figure out how they want to move forward. They also need support in many cases, getting documentation. You know, if you think about a fire coming through and you have to get out immediately with just the clothes on your back, oftentimes you've lost tax returns, you've lost identification, passports, and all of that has to be recreated. And when you've just lost everything, it's really a challenging system to work through. So we were fortunate in our region that we had relationships with a couple of law firms that stepped up to offer free support in helping folks to recover some of those necessary documents. Certainly our case managers were able to help with that issue as well. The other piece of this is, you know, there are rules surrounding what you can do with charitable resources in helping individuals recover. And the long and short of it is that it has to be need-based. So right after, immediately following a disaster, you can provide housing, mental health, counseling, food, clothing, those type of basic need recovery items without having to do a needs-based assessment. But anything outside of 6 to 8 weeks from the disaster, helping folks rebuild, helping to replace items that were lost, you have to go through a need-based process. And at the Community Foundation, we don't have that kind of expertise, and so we had to work with our nonprofit partners to set that up so that we could work through them to make sure that we were following the rules that are set forth by the IRS around providing charitable contributions to individuals after a disaster. So that's something else. I think, you know, we didn't have the luxury of putting together this team of people and deciding who was going to play what role. It kind of happened after the fact, which makes it a whole lot more difficult to determine who's going to do what and to set up a system. And, you know, learning from those of us who have gone through this, having those conversations and building those partnerships before disaster strikes so that in the immediate aftermath, everybody knows what role they're going to play and there's not this sense of overlap or wasted time and energy, I think is a really important thing to do, and a really great opportunity that you have so that if something ever happens, that you're able to step forward and serve your communities in a much more effective and efficient way right off the bat is really important. So what we learned from our experience is that you can't plan soon enough. Again, having an understanding of who is going to do what, in particular, you know, the limitations of organizations and what they can and can't do is a great thing so that you can plug those holes. Again, you know, as much as I want to give props to the Red Cross, they did have their hands tied in many different ways. So we were able to step forward and provide gas cards immediately, and you know, one of our experiences was we actually had to work with a group out of Okanogan County. We had to use our relationships and our resources, and we had to buy certain kinds of gas cards because the areas that were under evacuation only had one gas station, and so you couldn't just put a call out for, you know, Safeway gas cards because there was no Safeway. We had certain things that we had to make sure that we paid attention to, and then we had to find a runner who actually had the authority to get past the blockades to get the gas cards into the areas that folks needed them. So those are the kinds of things that you have to anticipate beforehand, how you're going to deal with getting the folks who need things, the items that will help them in the process. The other thing is, you know, having some flexible funding to. We bought things like dentures and eyeglasses, hearing aids, all sorts of things that you never think about. But when people lose their homes, they lose all of these different items that can't be easily replaced with insurance. We also didn't have a federal declaration for an individual relief package, and so there wasn't a FEMA component where people were written checks. So again, that falls back in many cases on the local community to help support those ongoing needs. So again, I can't stress enough that a lot of you on this phone call have this really wonderful opportunity to put all of these roles into place in your communities and to anticipate some of the needs that could be coming forward based on what we've learned, and to set up a system that will work best for you. And certainly we're willing to help talk through the different options that we did. Our board was super supportive in the sense that every donation that came through, we didn't take any administrative fee off of. Every dollar that has gone out into the survivors of our disasters has been passed through to them. We've put significant staff time into this. The unmet needs table, which was set up of funders or other entities, the faith-based community, the business community, anyone who had a resource to offer to victims. We've been meeting on a weekly basis for the last 3 years. We anticipate we've got at least 24 months to go to work through both the resources we have available we're still building houses, amazingly enough. We're still replacing infrastructure, wells, septic systems, electrical connections, solar packages, those kinds of things. So it's a very, very long process, and I think that people, you know, especially with the media today, you know, it's one disaster after another, and we hear a lot about it for a week or so, and then it goes quiet. Well, it doesn't go quiet in your local communities. It's ongoing. It's constant for a long period of time, and I think having that knowledge that you're in for the long haul is a really important thing to keep in mind, because you're going to have some sustainability to be able to move forward and to be able to do this work. So when you're putting your partners together, I think you need to be very clear with them that this isn't a one and done kind of a thing. They're going to need to step forward and be willing to put staff time in, and they're going to have to be able to resource that, whether that's through additional donations in addition to what you're raising money for, the transfer directly to victims. That's something else to keep in mind as well. And with that, I think I'll give it back to Hilary, and I know that she's got time for questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Beth. I know that all of North Central Washington really, really appreciates the Community Foundation, and it was really important for us as a local community to be, a smaller community, to be thinking about, okay, if a fire did occur here, who would take cash donations and who would have the ability to distribute funding, and not just cash donations, but clothing and food and resources. So it's definitely a lot to think about and definitely important. We will have questions for both of our presenters in a few minutes, but I want to transition. There are just so many ways, different levels to support homeowners and landowners. So through pre-planning for we had a pre-planning for Postfire Recovery workshop held in 2017, and we asked Kirsten Cook from the Okanogan Conservation District to kind of present on their efforts to support landowners in recovery. And we learned there, which I hadn't even known about, but I talked to Kirsten a lot, is that they had created a private lands burned area emergency response team, a BEAR team. And so we asked them to share a little bit with us today about their work and how they have been working with homeowners and landowners in a post-fire context, day in and out. So today, Leslie is a soil scientist from the Okanogan Conservation District, where she has been employed since 2012. She has a bachelor's in social science and is currently working on her master's in social science at Washington State University. Leslie has led and co-led 3 burned area emergency response teams for state and private lands in Washington, and she works primarily with farmers developing innovative solutions to improve soil health. Leslie, I'll pass it off to you.
So as you guys know, in July of 2014, there were a couple of fires that converged to form the Carlton Complex. So by the 16th of July, those fires had picked up with the wind and were moving at sort of an astounding rate of 3.8 acres per second. By the time that had all calmed down, 256 acres were burned. And a third of that was federal, a third was state, and a third was private. And so this had become the state's largest wildfire. But unlike a lot of other wildfires that are experienced, because so much of that was state and private lands, we knew that our response couldn't be like other fires. And so our conservation district really sat back and said, what can we do to help our community? And our manager, Craig Nelson, had some conversations with Catherine Rowden of the National Weather Service and Amy Hendershot of NRCS, and they had worked with the Clockham Charps Fire the previous year, and they really stressed that getting a BEAR assessment on those state and private lands was critical because of the post-fire flooding. And so Craig started working to find out how we could figure out how to get this done. And so he worked with FEMA and the Forest Service to guide us in this process. And the Forest Service was reluctant, but with FEMA's help, they finally agreed they weren't sure we could pull it off, but in about a week, we worked really hard and pulled together a team of 20 people from about 16 different organizations to run a bear team. So for that team, we had a Forest Service lead and 2 additional team members from the Forest Service. So I'll tell you a little bit about bear teams. Simply, a bear team is assessing values at risk. So a value at risk is a home, a critical access road, culverts, cultural resources, wildlife. It could be fish, it can be other sorts of wildlife, and then looking upstream at the soils and how those soils are going to move and affect those values at risk. So a bear team is composed of engineers, soil scientists, hydrologists, archaeologists, GIS specialists, fisheries biologists, communications, and we often include range specialists or foresters. A federal team will often assess any fire that's 500 acres or more. That's their rule. And so on a federal team, a bear assessment can take anywhere from 1 day with 1 person up to 2 weeks with 20 people or more. Of course, that's not feasible for our state and private lands. So what we're really have been working on is trying to figure out how a bear assessment works for this state and private lands team. And so in 2014, we followed the Forest Service setup, and we took the full 2 weeks and ran through this system. And so again, in 2015, we had these fires, and this time when we approached the Forest Service about working with us, they were unable to help us. And so it was left up to the state and private lands team to pull together. So since I had co-led the original team, I got to be the lead on that Okanogan Complex team. So we had, the Okanogan Complex year, we had 17 members from 11 different organizations, and we did that in 10 days. The Okanogan Complex was a total of 4,666,000 acres, and we assessed almost half of that. We worked in conjunction with the tribe on a portion of that as well. So we've done a total of 4 teams over 2014, 2015, and 2016. We also did the Carpenter Road Fire in 2015, and that was 63,000 acres, and we assessed about 60% of that, and we had 12 members on that team from 10 different organizations, and we did that in 7 days. And then in 2016, there was the Yale Road Fire. That was outside of Spokane, and it was a smaller 6,000-acre fire, and it was all state and private lands. And there was a lot of concern. It was there in a valley, and so there was a lot of concern about specific homes. And so it was a small 5-member team from 4 different organizations, and they ran that in 4 days. So what is typically produced from a bear team is a summary report, which is all the information in a really short condensed, and by condensed at 27 pages. And this is something that industry people can use. It gives you a really good idea of the highlights from the rest of the report. There's also individual profession reports, and those would be a soils report, an engineering report, a hydrologist report, and a cultural resources report. And then we also host closeout meetings. And this is an opportunity to bring in people such as Public Works, the Forest Service, any of your involved agencies that have an interested stake in what's going on. So as far as the state and private lands, burned area emergency response teams, things that I think that we've done really well is that we've really focused on using local people and local knowledge. And I think this has been a really big asset to us in each team has been a little bit different, but especially when you're pulling in fish biologists who already know a lot of the information for the area. So they already have their GIS files. They already know the issues that are going on in the streams. We use some of the local conservation district people, and so they already know the local landowners and can get access to private land, which is really critical when you are working with private land. And if you don't have access like you do on federal land, it can be an issue. So using local people has a lot of value. It's also been really beneficial as we have done more of these to have staff that have come back and done multiple years and become more trained in the process. Talking through the system with federal, state, local, and tribal, we've developed those relationships, and they're really key. And I would say even having those conversations before the fire starts, through the process, every step of the way, keeping that communication open is really important. On the Carpenter Road fire, I'm going to talk a couple of things that we did I thought was really great on that fire. One, we were located in the county building, and that we were able to interact with the commissioners in Stevens County, and they were really interested in what we were doing, and they were really excited that we were there. And I thought that really allowed us to build a good relationship in Stevens County. We also, while we were there, the Conservation District and the commissioners brought in legislative representatives. And so we were able to talk at a higher level about what we were doing. And so that was really important. The Carpenter Road fire also was different from Okanogan in that they had a lot of private lands that were owned by the logging industry. And so what was really important to me is that when we wrote our recommendations, that those recommendations were feasible for those organizations. So instead of mulching, we recommended slash and spread. So while ultimately slash and spread doesn't have quite as good of erosion benefit, it also, for a logging industry, is a lot more feasible. And so I wanted to make sure that our recommendations were something that they were going to be willing to do and were more likely to do if it came out in a report. And we heard afterwards that they were very pleased with what we did, and so we ended that with on a very good note. And so these reports have been used to fund seeding through the Conservation Commission. They've been used for NRCS's and the Natural Resources Conservation Service Emergency Watershed Protection Program. And so the BARC, which is the Burned Area Reflectance Classification, is a set of imagery that becomes really critical in the process. We turn that, in the process, we turn the BARC into a soil burn severity map. So many of you may be familiar with that. And so that soil burn severity map becomes really critical for this emergency watershed protection program, which they're also looking at, particularly homes. And so this process of EWP and the BEAR teams are really closely tied together. And we also got a lot of requests from emergency management and police from the area as far as where are areas of concern, areas that they should watch out for in case of flooding.
I think a lot of times we look at home assessments and fuel reduction programs as kind of like our gateway to fire-adapted community practices. But I think what we're seeing in Washington is that a lot of our entry points in the FAC and the fire adaptation cycle for engaging organizations and partners and homeowners and landowners have been after the fire. So it can, I think, kind of what I've taken away from a lot of our work is that it can start with a poem, it can start with like a conversation with a neighbor who went through something, or just like volunteering to help in post-fire recovery efforts. So the Toolkit Coalition was especially inspired, and in 2015, I met Allison Green and Ed Keith from Project Wildfire in Oregon, and Allison Lerch and Ashley, Laura, and George McKinley from Southwest Oregon, and we realized that our communities kind of had a lot in common, that we hadn't had a fire in a long time, and then we did similar work, and so we created this Pacific Northwest learning exchange, and where we went to each other's communities and learned about the work that we were doing. And when the Project Wildfire and the Southern Oregon FAC group, we were developing this learning exchange, they were very interested in also learning from our partners from North Central Washington and what they had done through their post-fire recovery work. And so we worked a lot with Chelan County Fire District 1, which is one of our WAFAC communities, Beth from the Community Foundation, Okanogan Conservation District. We had a representative from a local grief group who was helping homeowners and process their loss. And we share this work with our FAC partners. Next slide, please, Liz. So we learned a couple things. Through this work, we learned that it takes kind of your elected official to be the face and the voice for your community, and that agreements need to be in place to dispose of large amounts of debris, because there's a lot to clean up. If you don't have those agreements in place, it's really hard for your local landfills, transfer stations to take that on. Recognition of what national volunteer organizations can and can't do after a disaster, and knowing who they are and what they can do. Each one is kind of a little bit different. Who's going to take donations? Who are trustworthy organizations that can handle and distribute those donations? And what are your short and long-term housing options. We also learned that human service organizations are tapped out 6 to 18 months after a disaster, not always immediately after. So again, inspired by our neighbors who developed an after the fire guide, we kind of replicated that, and Okanogan Conservation District developed an amazing guide. It's pretty landscape focused, and we wanted to create something kind of more broad in scope. And so we've put together a guide to pass out to homeowners and landers. We was just like, here's your first steps. Who do you call now? Who do you call later? What are the financial considerations that you need to be thinking about? And so this is currently being translated, but we would love to share this with all of you when we're done. And this is something that they can carry with them every day. A homeowner or landowner can carry with them every day as they're moving through this recovery process, and keep track of the conversations they've had, where, who they need to contact, who they've contacted. Again, a tool for them to use as they're moving through this recovery process, because they may or may not have these important numbers, and they might be starting from ground zero. So from that learning exchange, we didn't want to stop there. Next slide, please, Liz. Our partners from Oregon, we had a second learning exchange, and we met in Hood River, and this time we brought our community partners. We brought our chamber members, our county planners, city planners, FireWise community leaders from each of our communities, and try to create kind of a network so that they could share and learn from each other too in how to develop, kind of do some pre-planning for post-fire recovery. And so I asked Ed and Allison, they are currently moving forward, so I asked them to just take a minute or two and share where they are in their pre-planning for post-fire recovery process. We understand that these are all emerging practices, but I thought it'd be interesting if you guys could just take a minute to just share the amazing work that you're doing in Oregon. Ali, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. This is Allison Lerch. I'm the FireAdapted Communities Coordinator with Ashland Fire and Rescue, and thanks for having me on this call. I was invited to come to the Hood River Exchange for Business Resiliency and Long-Term Recovery, and I was able to bring 2 members of our Chamber of Commerce, local Ashland Chamber of Commerce, with me. And ever since that workshop, we have been empowered to get ahead of the game as much as possible, and we wouldn't be able to have all this information if we weren't a part of these networks and a part of these exchanges. So what we have been working on is we hosted a wildfire summit at the end of 2016 with our entire Chamber of Commerce board, and we put out some of these questions to them, similar to what Hilary has been talking about. What are our needs pre, during, and post-fire recovery? And what happened was we realized that the post-fire recovery part was the one part that we really didn't have many answers to. So we have a local wildfire task force that we have created that has chamber board members, wildfire mitigation commissioners, as well as members of the fire department. And we meet monthly, and we're basically tackling these issues of, insurance issues is what we're really working on right now, because a lot of the people that live in Southwest Oregon are actually from California and have friends or family that have suffered losses from the North Bay fires. And so right now we're trying to work with our local insurance agents and through our FireWise communities and through our chamber to make sure that people are as insured as they need to be in case of loss, and so they don't have to have that after the fact conversation that may not be what they would like to hear. So that's one of the main things. We've brought in our local State Farm representative to talk with us about that, and we're also inviting them to our commission meetings. Another thing is we are trying to get out our written documentation and communication to all citizens. We're putting out an emergency preparedness guidebook for all addresses for the city of Ashland. So it'll be about 12,000 booklets that go out, and we do have a disaster resources page in there so that people can start thinking about who they can turn to post-fire. We are working on a few other things, but I'd like to turn it over to Ed.
Okay, hi everybody. Ed Keith. I work for Deschutes County as County Forester and serve as the chair for our local fire preparedness group. It's called Project Wildfire. As Hilary talked about, we really got started on this journey through our two learning exchanges. Most of our work in the past had really been on pre-fire activities like fuel reduction and some during the fire activities like evacuation planning, but we really hadn't given any thought to post-fire recovery at all. And then as we started participating in the learning network and watching some of our neighbors to the north go through a lot of that, we were really inspired to learn more about that. So we were able to travel up to Wenatchee and hear firsthand basically a longer version of what you heard from Beth here this morning about some of what they went through and what they wish they had maybe done or considered it in advance of a fire. And so we really thought we had important work to do in that regard as well. So what we've been doing since that time is the trip to Hood River to have kind of that initial conversation with an expanded group of stakeholders from our local Central Oregon group, and really hear from what some of the folks in Washington had gone through and what they had experienced firsthand to a larger group of our stakeholders here. Right now we're in the process of kind of going through some of the steps that Beth lined out. We've kind of done the scan of our stakeholders, have been thinking about who needs to be at the table to have this conversation. In January, we're going to have our first meeting of our larger group. It's been a very small group of folks, including our emergency manager, Allison Green with Project Wildfire, myself, and a couple other departments within local government in the county here. But we're really looking to expand that out. So we're going to be sitting down in January having that initial conversation with some of our community-based and faith-based organizations, as well as more people that have a role within local governments, such as our solid waste department, community development department, health department, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we're at so far. Our hope is that we're going to go into the fire season with an expanded group of people that have at least come to the table, had that conversation, and thought about what role they can play. We're going to try to get that down on some paper as a first draft of a post-fire recovery plan, essentially just outlining what each organization can bring to the table and what roles they can play, and have that all down on paper, and just as at least as a first step. I know we won't have all the details figured out, but we'll at least have some of our stakeholders and partners that we haven't engaged in our pre-fire or during the fire work. We'll have those contacts made. We'll have it in their mind that they could potentially have a role to play should a fire require some extensive community-based recovery. So that's what we're going through here in Central Oregon, just trying to convene the group and have those conversations in advance. And I will turn it back to Hilary.